This video is going to cover everything you need to know about JSX within React. We're going to talk about what is JSX, how it actually works kind of under the hood, and then we're going to talk about the 6 rules of JSX that are very important to know if you're wanting to be a professional React developer. Okay, so first things first, what is JSX? Well, JSX stands for JavaScript XML, and it's effectively JavaScript that looks like HTML. So when you're writing JSX, you're going to write stuff that looks very similar to just regular HTML, but what you're actually writing is JavaScript. And what's eventually going to happen when you write this JSX, it's eventually going to produce DOM elements. It's going to be very similar to doing things like document.createElement, and then you append that element to the DOM. But React is a library that's going to take care of all that DOM manipulation for you. And React can also be used in React Native and on mobile, so it doesn't necessarily have to be with the DOM, but this HTML syntax is actually just going to be JavaScript. So it's JavaScript XML. And like I said, it is syntactic sugar. And it's actually going to compile down to, or it's going to get transformed into React.createElement function calls, which will then produce these elements. And in the instance of working with the web, it's going to create DOM elements, and it's going to append those to the DOM, to that document object model. Now, technically, you don't need to use JSX when writing React apps. You could just call React.createElement everywhere and, create your React apps that way. However, I think that you're going to see in some examples here that JSX is going to be much easier to read. It's going to lead to much more maintainable code. It's much more concise. It's going to allow you to create components and create these independent components that you can use, kind of reuse all over your app. And it is the standard today for creating React apps. So I definitely recommend when using React to use JSX. So let me actually show you an example of what this looks like. And in this example here, what I'm using is a tool called Babel. And you can think of this as kind of like a transformer. It will transform our JSX into JavaScript and into those React.createElement calls. And React is a library, and it gives us this kind of React object. And what you're doing with React.createElement is you're accessing the .createElement on the overall React object that React gives you. So as you can see in this example here, on the left side here, this is me writing JSX. And on the right side is what this Babel transformer will turn this JSX into. So as I said before, the JSX I write here, it's going to look like HTML, but it's going to be transformed into these React.createElement calls. So on the left here, this is React code. And in React, your components should start with a capital letter. So I'm just fixing that up there. It should be capital my component there. And then as you can see in this return statement of this function here, I'm basically returning what looks a lot like HTML. This looks like just basic HTML, to where I have this kind of container div here, and then I'm returning an H1 with an ID and a title here, and then I'm returning a P tag with a class name and a little bit of text there. And we'll talk about why this is class name instead of class here later on. But then you can see that this gets compiled into, well, we still have the same function component here, and then a return statement. But then you can see I return these React.createElement calls, to where it's like, okay, I first pass an argument that is a string, that is a div, and then here within that div, I call React.createElement again. So I nest this React.createElement call, and then I pass in H1 so I can create an H1, and then I pass it an ID and then the text there. And then I do the same thing for this P tag. And as you can see here, it's going to be a bunch of function calls that are nested within each other. And this generally looks pretty messy, right? Whereas this looks like just writing basic HTML. And this right here is JSX. This is what we call JSX. Looks very much like HTML, but it's actually not. This is JavaScript, and a converter like Babel will transform this into regular JavaScript. But what you write in React is this right here. And this is that JavaScript XML syntax that gets converted into these JavaScript React.createElement calls. So just to be clear, this is JSX, and then it gets converted into these JavaScript calls here to where we basically just call React.createElement to create all these elements. And then if you're working with a DOM, those will eventually be appended to the DOM, and React has very performant ways of doing that. So with that kind of gives you an idea of what JSX is, but JSX does have some specific rules to it. So this first one is that attributes within HTML, they aren't camel case. So for example, in HTML, you would add a on-click attribute to some element that handles a on-click. But as you can see here, this attribute is actually camel case as it's JavaScript. So the standard here is to write your attributes in kind of camel case notation. All right. So that is the very first rule of JSX. They should be camel case. It should not be all lowercase like this. And as you can see, it kind of gives me a kind of code hint here in my editor to saying for this JSX attribute, do you want it to actually be on click to be camel case? All right. So your HTML attributes should be camel case. That is rule number one. Rule number two is some HTML attributes will actually have name collisions within JavaScript. So since this isn't HTML, it's actually JavaScript. If I just wrote class here and used the keyword class, well, in JavaScript, the class keyword notates that you're going to actually create a class there. It's not saying that you're going to add a class attribute to something. So to avoid this name collision between a JSX attribute and regular JavaScript class keywords, you actually use the class name syntax as an attribute. So instead of class, you use class name as an attribute. And then another example of this is in regular HTML, for your labels, you would add a for attribute. But in JavaScript, you write for loops. So for is actually a keyword in JavaScript. So to get around that, React suggests that you use HTML for instead of just the for attribute. So for your labels within JSX, you're going to call your for attribute HTML for, and that's going to be camel case here. Now, if it's just a single word attribute that doesn't have a name collision in JavaScript, then it's just going to be that regular attribute name. So here on this input, you can see its type, ID, name. None of those attributes change. The only attributes that will change is if they have a name collision within JavaScript, or if they are like 2-word attributes. So on click, it's actually going to be camel case instead of just all lowercase like it might be in HTML. Now, the third rule of JSX is that you must close all tags. So even if a tag is self-closing within HTML, in JSX, you actually have to close that tag. So here we can see this input tag in regular HTML. I don't need to close this. I can just write this input just like this, and it's automatically going to be self-closing, and there's nothing I need to do there. But within JSX, I have to close this tag. It's just a rule of JSX. So here you can see I get an error here, and it says expected a corresponding JSX closing tag for the input element. So it's telling me right there, I need to close this tag. And then after I close it here with the slash, my error goes away. So in JSX, you must close your element tags. The fourth rule here is that you can only return one parent element within your JSX. So here you can see that I try to return an H1 as a sibling to this P element. These are on the same level, so to speak. So I'm actually kind of trying to return two different parent elements here that are siblings to each other. But within JSX, this is not allowed. You can only return one parent element. So what I could do here is I could wrap these elements in a div, and then I could place this within here, and this, let me just get this formatted here a little bit better. So here you can see now that I place these elements within this div, the errors go away because this div is my one parent element here. Now, this is not good HTML semantics. Just placing divs everywhere doesn't actually describe what our page should look like. So this is generally not good practice to do within HTML, and within HTML, generally, it is a good idea to avoid divs wherever possible and to use more descriptive HTML. So here, depending on what it was, I might put this in a main tag like so, or I might put this in a section tag if that makes more sense based on the context of where I'm placing this. But just try to be aware that you still want to use proper HTML semantics when writing React, as that's going to make your code more accessible and is generally just a best practice for the web. Now, another thing you can do within React is using React fragments. So a fragment is basically allowing you to add one parent element to your returned JSX statement without adding anything else to the DOM. So here, what a React fragment looks like is just an empty pair of brackets like this. This is syntax for a React fragment. It's these left and right brackets here, and then this left and right brackets here, but you technically close the ending bracket. This is a React fragment, and this allows you to return one parent element, but it does not create anything for the DOM. It will not add anything to the DOM. Now you can do this a different way as well. You can do React.fragment here, and let me just copy this and put it in my closing tag here, and let me close that correctly there. So this is also valid. You can use React.fragment, and that is the very same thing as using those empty tags like I did earlier. And you might want to use this like if you need to add a key to something you're mapping over within React, which I'll talk about that in future videos, you would need to use React.fragment. But if you're not using a key, I kind of prefer to just use the empty brackets like so. But those two are both equivalent, and it won't add anything to the DOM, and it will allow you to return that one single parent element. Now, rule number 5 here is that any JavaScript expression within your JSX should be placed within curly braces. So you can think about it as anything within curly braces within your JSX here, you're entering just normal JavaScript land. You are no longer in JSX land, you are in JavaScript land. So you can inject your JavaScript right into your JSX here. So here I have a function in which outside of the return statement in the body of my function, I assign a string, my YouTube channel, to the constant title, and then I assign a string, my channel is called Code Ryan, to a constant with the title of paragraph. And here within my JSX, I return a overall parent element that is a section, and then I have an H1, and then here I open up these curly braces, and this is me saying, hey, this is JavaScript land now. No longer JSX, I just want to inject my regular JavaScript code. And then here, as you can see, I use a template literal. So I use the backticks, and then I say my title is, and then $ curly brace, title. So I access my JavaScript variable here within my JSX return statement. And I effectively do the same thing here. So this is perfectly acceptable to do. I am just injecting my JavaScript into my JSX. And whenever I open up those curly braces like I do here, I am just saying, hey, I'm entering JavaScript land here, and I can do any like valid JavaScript expression within these curly braces. Now there's a catch here with rule number 6, but I could do quite a bit of different things within this, and this helps make your JSX a lot more dynamic because you can basically do anything that you can do in JavaScript, or most things. So for example, a very common thing here to do as well is, say I have an on click on this H1 here, which, doesn't make a lot of sense. But if I want to use JavaScript here, I can actually just inline a function into this on click here with JavaScript. So I'm going to open up the curly braces here, which is saying, hey, I want to be in JavaScript land right now. And here I can just pass a inline function here, and I could handle this on click event right within this function. So I could, I could set some state here within React, which I'll cover in future videos, but I could do any kind of valid JavaScript thing within this expression because I'm within these curly braces here. And I could also just, if I defined a function elsewhere in my program, I could just pass in the definition of that function here, and that would also be a valid thing to do. Okay, so within curly braces, that is basically telling your JSX that you are entering JavaScript land. Now, there's one kind of catch to this, to where curly braces, it equals JavaScript land, but no looping is allowed. You can write expressions within your JSX, within curly braces, but you cannot loop within your JSX. So let me show you an example here. So here you can see that I open up curly braces right here, but I try to write a for loop, and I try to do for const char of title and iterate over the characters and do something here. This is actually not a valid thing to do. I cannot write just a basic for loop within JSX. So for loops within JSX is not valid. But what you can do in JSX, which I will cover lists in JSX in future videos and mapping over lists, but just quickly here, you can map over an array within JSX and actually return new JSX elements from there. So I could do something like const my array is equal to just a array with some values there. And then valid JSX is to actually do my array.map. And then I could do the value, and then I could return something here. And this is actually valid to do within JSX. It's actually a very dynamic way to create new elements within your JSX and to do some cool things within JSX, but I will cover this specifically in future videos. Just know that a rule of JSX is that no looping is allowed. And not only is no looping allowed, but I also can't write conditionals. So I can't do something like if, my array dot length is greater than 0, do something. This is invalid JSX. It says it expected an expression, not this complete statement here. So I can't loop, I can't write if statements, but what you can do within JSX is you could use the double ampersand operators or a ternary operator and do your conditionals that way. And you could also write your if statements in your body of your function here. So here I have a Boolean called should show title, and I assign it to true. So I could say if should show title, then I could manipulate some value here. I could maybe mutate the title or something and do title is equal to new title. And then it will render out my new title in my return statement there. So you can write your if statements in the bodies of your function. That is totally valid to do. But if you want to use conditionals in your JSX, the most common way of doing so is using the double ampersand operator or the double bar operator or a ternary operator. So here, if I say should show title, ampersand, ampersand, title. So if should show title is true, then it returns the title here. But if this is false, it just returns nothing. And then here I could say should show title or title. So I could use the double bar operator as well. And then I could say should show title ? Okay, show the title, else just render out that there's no title. So I could also use a ternary operator. So the double ampersand sign, the double bars, the ternary operators, those are all valid in JSX, but you cannot write if statements and you cannot write your for statements and you cannot loop within JSX. But you can map over an array, but I'll cover that in future videos. So JSX, it stands for JavaScript XML. It's JavaScript that looks like HTML, but it will get converted into JavaScript and it gets converted into React.createElement calls. And you could technically use those React create element calls everywhere, but as we saw in our example, that seems like maybe not the best approach and is definitely not standard. And then there are 6 rules of JSX. Your JSX attributes must be camel case. Additionally, if there are name collisions between your JSX attributes and JavaScript keywords, then you use some different attribute names for those. So class gets turned into class name, the for attribute gets turned into HTML4, and so on. Also, all tags must be closed. So like a self-closing input tag, that still needs to be closed within JSX. Additionally, you can only return one parent element, but still use semantic HTML and don't just throw divs around everywhere. Additionally, if you want to use JavaScript within your JSX, you must use curly braces and write your JavaScript within those curly braces to tell JSX that you are now entering just JavaScript land. However, even if you use curly braces, you still can't write statements. You can't write if statements, you cannot write for loops, but you can use ternaries, double ampersand signs, the or operator, so the double bars. Enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something. Stay tuned for more React videos, and I will see you in that next one.